The wintering camp along the upper Green River was little more than a scattering of cottonwood lean-tos, half-buried cache pits, and a long, low fire that smoldered through most nights. The year was the late 1820s, the height of the beaver trade already beginning to slip into decline. Men sensed it the way animals sense the coming of a hard winter, an unease in the bones, in the scarcity of fresh sign along the creeks, in the increasing boldness of the Blackfeet who had started shadowing the same trapping grounds they once ignored. This was a camp where men talked too loudly, drank too hard, and bragged to fill the silence that came when the traps came up empty. But among them was one man who did none of those things, Elias Boone Hardesty. Half-Scots, half-Métis, 30-odd years old, though no one could agree on the exact number. A quiet man with eyes the color of stormwater and a beard that grew sandy brown like the willows by the riverbank. He spoke seldom, listened always, and moved with the soft padded confidence of a man raised between two frontiers, the wooded river camps of the Red River Métis and the hard, wind-combed high country where the Jedediah Smith men had pushed their luck further than sense should permit. In camp he was known by many names: Old Bear Bait, from an incident years earlier on the upper Yellowstone, Hard to Kill Hardesty, and, more commonly, the Quiet Feller. But the name that stuck hardest and was used with both fondness and irritation was Mule Stubborn and Mountain Silent. Larpenteur wrote in his journals that winter camps were places where a fifth man's nature showed itself plain as tracks in snow. If that were true, Elias's tracks showed a man who preferred the edges of the firelight, sharpening his Green River knife on a whetstone, or sewing new leather patches to his moccasins, or simply sitting with his back to a log, watching the flames as though they alone spoke, a language he understood. The others filled the cold nights with tall talk and arguments. Hugh McDermott cursed the beaver decline. Two Iroquois freemen argued over who had lost more traps to the Blackfeet that season. A wiry French-Canadian named Larocque tried to turn every conversation toward a story about a woman in street, Louis, who, by his telling, had fallen sick from missing him. Elias answered none of it, not with words anyway. But the men watched him. They always watched the quiet ones. It was on such a night cold as split iron, with the moon rising like a tarnished coin over the Wind River Range, that the talk turned, as it sometimes did, to Spanish gold. A familiar yarn in the mountains, a favorite among greenhorns, a subject guaranteed to make old hands laugh while still glancing toward the dark, as if wary of listening spirits. Larocque began it, as he always did. "I tell you, mes amis, there was mines, real ones, Jesuit mines, Spaniards digging silver in these mountains long before any of us were born." A holler of laughter broke from McDermott. "Aye, and next you'll say they built a palace up here too, in the high country, heated with buffalo dung and snowmelt tea. Even runs on snow," the Shoshone hunter smirked from his place near the fire. "Spanish mines," someone repeated, snorting. "A myth fit for greenhorns. Jesuit fairy stories. Spaniards hardly made it this far north." "True enough," said another. "These mountains chew up an armored priest before he got 10 miles in." Elias listened. He always listened. But tonight, his hands stilled on the piece of rawhide he'd been stitching. His eyes flicked toward the firelight, reflecting the sparks. Larocque noticed. "You there, Hardesty. You've wandered more country than most of us. Ever see sign of Spanish workings? Old pits? Carved crosses? Mule shoes? Anything like that?" A hush. Not because the subject was sacred, but because Elias was being addressed directly, and when he chose to speak, men listened. But he did not speak. He simply reached inside his possibles bag. For a moment, the only sound was the crack of the fire and the distant howl of something, maybe a wolf, maybe the wind along the cottonwoods. Then Elias withdrew something wrapped in oiled cloth. He set it gently on his knee, unwrapped it, rawhide, stiff, scorched in places, edges stitched with sinew. The camp fell silent in the way camps do when something important, something old, something not meant for ordinary eyes is placed before them. On the rawhide were marks not crude, not native, not French. Sharp, measured. Symbols like those seen on Spanish colonial survey pieces, the same type AMM researchers later identified on mule train ledgers and early mining claims from New Spain. There were mineral symbols, silver, copper, something that might have meant cinnabar or fire rock. There were written words too. Castilian script, though, half burnt, half faded. Larocque leaned close. "Mon Dieu, is that?" "Looks like Spanish writin'," McDermott murmured, astonished despite himself. Another trapper snorted, trying to hide unease. "Ain't worth dirt. Somebody probably scratched that up to make a greenhorn piss his britches," Jesuit scribbles, "or some priest's fever dream." "A myth," someone said. "Like I told you, a map to a story that never happened." But Elias remained silent. His face gave nothing. Only the reader, and perhaps one quiet soul in the camp, would have guessed the truth. This map had been given to him by a dying wanderer years before, a man whose blood carried both Ute earth and Spanish sorrow. A man whose last words had been of Las Minas del Rey Carlos, the mines of King Charles, and of a canyon where the stones burned even in winter. Elias folded the map shut, rewrapped it, returned it to the depths of his possibles bag without comment. "Mountains silent," Larocque muttered, trying to break the tension. "Mule stubborn, too. You show us a Spanish map, then act like it's nothin'." McDermott barked a laugh. "He don't say much because he don't want to be laughed at. That's why." But none of them laughed now, not fully. In truth, they did not know what unsettled them more, the possibility the map was false or the possibility that it wasn't. The fire popped. Sparks drifted upward like lost souls departing. The wind hissed along the river ice. A wolf cried again, closer this time. Elias tied his possibles bag with calm, practiced hands. His expression did not change, but something in the camp had. Later, the men would remember this night, the rawhide map, the silence that followed, the faint unease that clung to them like smoke. They would remember the way Elias had looked toward the dark ridge north of camp, the ridge where the wolf sounded, and how his eyes seemed to measure a danger none of them yet understood. At the time, they only muttered, "Hardesty's chasing ghost trails," "Spanish mines," "fool's errands," a myth and a quiet man who's half mad to believe it. But winter in the Rockies has a way of teaching men what truly matters. And in the months that followed, every soul in that camp would come to learn a different truth, a hard truth written in tracks, blood, and fire. The ridge north of camp rose like the spine of some ancient creature, a saw-toothed line of basalt and wind-scoured snow that caught moonlight in hard, silver angles. Elias Boone Hardesty trudged along it alone, his snowshoes whispering over crusted drifts. He had gone out late, later than any man with sense would have, to check the final set of traps before the cold tightened them shut for good. A beaver pelt could mean the difference between eating and going hungry during the next storm, and Elias had never been one to leave work until morning. Behind him, far down the slope where the cottonwood stood black against the snow, the sounds of camp drifted faintly, laughter, a bit too loud, Larocque's singing, a bit too slurred, the persistent crack of the fire. Ahead of him was only quiet. The kind of quiet old trappers said meant trouble. He knelt to free a trap half buried beneath ice. The beaver taken in it was small, hardly worth the trouble, but he skinned it with efficient hands and wrapped the pelt into his pack. The wind shifted, carrying with it a scent that made every hair on the back of his neck rise. Not the clean musk of elk, not the wet, earthy drift of deer. This scent was sharper, wilder, wolves. More than one. He rose slowly, turning toward the ridge's higher spine. Snow shuffled somewhere beyond the next knoll. A low, throaty growl rolled out of the dark, followed by another, and then a sound that froze a man's marrow, a chorus of wolves singing the hunger song. Not two or three, a pack, a big one. In the late 1820s, the journals of traders and army officers were filled with accounts of winter-starved wolf packs that shadowed buffalo herds or trailed travelers for miles. Fewer elk this season, fewer deer. Hunger made them bold. Hunger made them desperate. Elias took stock with the speed of a man long practiced at measuring odds. One Kentucky long rifle, already loaded, one spare ball and charge, one Green River knife, a handful of pitch pine knots in his pack. A ridge with a sheer drop on the left, a steep slope on the right. No help for miles. If the pack decided to rush him, it was over. He wasn't faster than wolves. No man was. The first shapes appeared over the rim of the next rise, gray bodies low to the snow, tails straight, ears forward. The moon limned their backs in cold fire. Elias counted 5, then 8, then more shifting in the shadow behind. The pack fanned out. Silent now. Silent was worse. Silent meant decision. Elias backed slowly toward a narrow jut of basalt, a defensible perch he'd noted on the way up. His breath plumed in front of him. The wolves padded closer, testing his courage, testing his footing. He struck flint to steel, sparks catching on a twist of pitch pine he'd pulled from his pack. Smoke curled first, then flame. Wolves feared fire more than steel. That was the hope, anyway. The first wolf lunged. Elias fired without hesitation. The long rifle's roar cracked across the ridge, echoing to the valley below. The wolf dropped, sliding across the snow in a dark streak. The pack hesitated a heartbeat, no more than spread wider. Elias rammed the torch into a patch of wind-hardened snow and lit a second knot. He cast the burning chunk in a high arc. It landed with a hiss and flare, the fire licking across the snow. A wolf flinched back, ears flat. He needed more fire. Fire made a boundary. Fire bought time. He pulled 3 more knots from his pack. His gloves were stiff with cold fingers, uncooperative, but he managed to light each one. He placed them in a half circle around the basalt outcrop, a crude ring of flame against the dark. The wolves paced beyond it, ghost shapes moving back and forth like restless spirits. Their eyes glinted in the firelight, dozens of them, 20, maybe more. Elias crouched, breath slow, heartbeat steady. Fear did him no good. Panic did worse. The quiet in him, the same quiet that men joked about, the same quiet they mistook for dullness, was what kept him alive now. Somewhere far off, a lone buffalo cow bawled. The wolves heard it too. Their ears snapped toward the sound, bodies tense. Hunger warred with opportunity. Elias reached into his pack and tore a strip of beaver meat he'd meant for bait. He flung it downhill as far as his arm allowed. The meat struck snow with a soft thud. 3 wolves broke away instantly, diving after it. Others followed, snarling, pushing. The pack's attention fractured. Now he had to move. Now. Elias snatched up his rifle, shoved the smoldering torch into his belt, and climbed the basalt spine. The rock tore at his moccasins, but gave him height all he needed. From there, he could slide down the safe side of the ridge into the aspen draw below. The wolves followed a moment later, but the fire ring slowed them. Their hunger made them clumsy. Their confusion cost them seconds. Seconds were all Elias required. He slid, half controlled, half falling, down the far slope, snow erupting around him. Branches whipped his coat. His rifle banged against his hip. At the bottom he hit the frozen ground hard, rolled, and rose running. The wolves reached the ridge edge too late. They paced, howling, thwarted by terrain. They could not descend with the same speed. Their cries chased him all the way back to camp. By the time he reached the cottonwoods, dawn was bleeding into the sky, faint and cold. Tobacco smoke drifted from the fire pit where McDermott was stirring embers for breakfast. "You're out early," McDermott grunted without looking up. Quiet as always. Elias did not answer. He simply removed his snowshoes, set down his pack, and sat by the fire. Later, when the others learned what had happened when they followed the tracks and saw the circle of burned pitch pine on the ridge, the blood streaks, the torn snow, the story began to spread. First in camp, then at the rendezvous, then in forts along the Missouri. 20 wolves, men said. 20. And Elias Boone Hardesty faced them alone and came back walking. It was only the beginning of his legend, and only the first night his map would prove itself more truth than myth. The morning after the wolf attack dawned pale and brittle, sunlight scattering across the river ice in cold, broken shards. Frost clung to every cottonwood branch, turning the wintering camp into a forest of ghost trees. The men woke late, muttering, rubbing sleep from their eyes, nursing the remains of last night's whiskey fire. But when they saw the tracks on the ridge, the trampled snow, the scorch marks from pitch pine, the bloody drag where Elias had dropped the first wolf, all conversation shifted. Rough men who had faced grizzlies, Blackfeet war parties, and starvation paused to take in the story told in snow. 20 wolves, maybe more, McDermott whispered. Tracks go every which way. A whole pack circled him. And he walked back like it was nothing, LaRock added, crossing himself for good measure. But Elias Boone Hardesty said none of it. He sat by the fire sharpening his knife with the same calm he used for every morning task. By midday, the talk had circled back, as it often did in winter camps, to the rawhide map he had revealed the night before. The wolf story had changed how the men spoke of it. Myths seemed less laughable after a man stalked by death returned untouched. LaRock crouched beside Elias, breath steaming. "Hardesty, that map of yours. You didn't make it up," Elias continued, sharpening. "Shh, shh, shh. Steel on stone. It's old," LaRock persisted. "Those marks, I seen Spanish symbols like that once on a mule train ledger back near Taos." "Spaniards didn't range this far north," McDermott countered. "That's Devoto's own writin'. The Crown stayed close to the Rio Grande, didn't like stretchin' supply lines." "Jesuits wandered," LaRock shot back. "Priests with dreams in their pockets. I heard stories from a Crow woman who said Spanish ghosts walk the mountains where fire comes out the ground. Runs in the snow." The Shoshone hunter lifted his head at that. His voice was quiet, careful. "My grandfather spoke of men with iron hats who came long ago. They dug holes in the Black Rock country. The spirits did not like it. The mountains swallowed them." A hush fell. Even the wind seemed to pause. Every man felt it, the weight of stories, too old to confirm and too persistent to dismiss. At last Elias rose. His movements were unhurried. He reached into the possibles bag at his side and withdrew the rawhide again, laying it flat upon a slab of frozen log. The firelight flickered across the scorched hide, illuminating the faint ink strokes and mineral symbols. Today, no one laughed. Not one man dared. The map was old, older than the fur trade, older than the fort on the Yellowstone that had not yet been built, older even than most tribes' stories of first contact with the Spanish. The script along its edge, though burned in parts, bore unmistakable resemblance to the handwriting seen in 18th-century colonial ledgers preserved at Santa Fe. Elias touched a finger to the symbols. "This one's silver," he said quietly. "This one means copper. This one, I'm not sure. Could be cinnabar or fire rock. You can read that?" McDermott breathed. "Man I got it from showed me enough." At last he spoke of that man, the dying Ute Spanish wanderer he'd found near Brown's Park 3 years earlier. Elias had been returning from a trapline when he spotted a vulture circling overhead. Beneath the cottonwoods lay a man barely clinging to life, wrapped in a blanket stitched with both indigenous beadwork and old Spanish thread. "He was half-burned," Elias said, voice low. "Clothes scorched. Said he escaped from a canyon where the rocks breathed heat." "Volcanic vents?" LaRock whispered. "Could be," Elias replied. But he called them piedras quemadas, burning stones. The dying man had carried the rawhide map, bound to his chest with sinew. He pressed it into Elias's hands with shaking fingers, muttering phrases in a tangled mix of Ute, Spanish, and delirium. Only a few words were clear. "Las Minas del Rey Carlos," the mines of King Charles, hidden beyond the canyon of burning stones. "He died before midnight," Elias finished simply. "Buried, him under cottonwoods. Map's all he had left." "And you never followed it?" McDermott asked, incredulous. "Would have been folly," Elias said. "I had no help, no horses, scarce food. And those lands weren't safe. Still aren't." The men leaned over the map again, studying it with new respect. The hide had been burned in places, deliberately scorched, as though someone had tried to destroy it. Ink bled into the rawhide, forming shapes that were part map, part memory, part warning. "Why'd the old man burn it?" LaRock murmured. Elias shook his head. "Don't know. Fear, maybe. Or someone wanted this lost." Runs in the Snow stood abruptly. Some places are meant to stay forgotten. The others fell quiet. The only sound was the crackle of fire and the distant creak of river ice shifting under early-season thaw. But something had shifted inside the men, a pressure, an itch. Beaver were thinning fast. The Blackfeet were growing bolder. The trade would not last forever. But a Spanish mine? Even a ruined one? Even a forgotten one? The possibility gnawed at them. Finally, McDermott spoke what every man felt. "So, are you going after it?" Elias wrapped the map carefully and returned it to his bag. "Not alone." LaRock grinned. "Then not for long." Runs in the Snow frowned, uneasy, but did not walk away. The ridge where the wolves had gathered lay stark and silent beyond the cottonwoods, a white scar against the sky. The pack had withdrawn, but its memory hung over the camp like a shadow. And as evening fell, the wind carried a faint distant howl, a reminder that the mountains did not let men walk their secrets for free. Whatever the truth of the map, whatever waited in the burning stone country, the story had begun to claim them. The decision to follow the map did not happen with a grand speech or any bold declaration. Mountain men were not creatures of ceremony. They were creatures of weather, gut instinct, and the quiet arithmetic of survival. The morning after Elias told the story of the dying wanderer, 3 men quietly began preparing, as though their hands knew the choice long before their tongues admitted it. LaRock mended a snowshoe binding with babiche cord, humming some French voyageur tune. Runs in the Snow tested the edge of his trade gun flint, checking it for cracks. Elias packed parfleches with dried meat, tallow, and spare moccasins. McDermott watched from the fire, arms crossed. "Fools," he muttered. "Chastened Spanish ghosts." But even he could not hide the flicker of interest in his eyes. The wolf story still hung over camp like a legend in the making. And legends had a way of pulling men forward whether they liked it or not. Before noon, Elias had his party. Pierre Larocque, loud-mouthed, loyal, and too curious for his own good. Thomas Sawyer, Weller, the greenhorn from Ohio who had never seen mountains before this winter, but possessed a stubborn streak, thick as hickory wood. Runs in the Snow, quiet Shoshone hunter whose knowledge of the land surpassed all of them. They traveled light 3 pack horses, snowshoes, trade guns, and enough pemmican to keep men walking through the cold. The map rode in Elias's possibles bag, wrapped in oiled cloth and tied with sinew. Through every mile of wind-scoured trail, the weight of it pressed against his hip like a pulse. The first 3 days were deceptively kind. The weather held steady, the sky clear. The snow lay crusted hard by night wind, good for snowshoeing. They followed a trail Jedediah Smith himself had once used, a narrow cut along the foothills where willows bent low over water that rarely froze solid. But by the 4th day, the mountains reminded them of their nature. A storm clawed down from the high peaks, thick with stinging needles of snow. The horses balked, snorting, ears pinned. Visibility shrank to a few feet. They moved slowly, heads down, leaning into the gale. "Devil's trying to freeze us solid," LaRock cursed, snow clinging to his eyelashes. Sawyer slipped on a drift and plunged thigh-deep. "Why does anyone live out here?" he sputtered. Runs in the Snow gave a faint smile. "Because the world is too crowded everywhere else." They fought through the weather until dusk, finally finding shelter beneath an overhang of basalt where the wind screamed above but left a hollow calm below. The men built a fire from deadfall and pitch pine. Elias studied the map again, tracing ink faded by years. Sawyer sat beside him, steam rising from his wet leggings. "It really matches this land?" Elias nodded. "Some." "Enough." He tapped a symbol near the map's lower edge. "Canyon here." "Fire rock," the old man called it. "Volcanic?" Sawyer asked. LaRock snorted. "Boy, everything's volcanic if you've got enough whiskey." But Elias said nothing. He had seen the land beyond the wind rivers, the strange geysers, and vents mentioned by early Shoshone travelers, the places where the earth hissed steam even under snow. Rare, dangerous country, hidden. By the 6th day, the storm cleared, revealing a vast basin of white stretching toward distant black ridges. The cold deepened, every breath felt carved from glass. It was Runs in the Snow who noticed it first. Tracks, not elk, not deer, hoofprints, narrow, sharp-edged. Horses, he murmured. 3, 4 days old. Trappers? Sawyer asked hopefully. LaRoque's face tightened. Blackfeet. The word hung like a blade. The Blackfeet rarely ventured this far west in deep winter, but hunger and war parties sometimes bent old boundaries. The presence of their tracks meant one thing: this country was not empty. That night the men made a cold camp, no fire, huddling in blankets while frost grew on their beards. Elias did not sleep. His mind worked quietly, mapping the land not just by the rawhide in his bag but by instinct: elk, trails, wind shifts, the angle of foothills. He felt the mountains watching. On the 8th day the land changed. Not gradually, abruptly. Snow thinned. The air smelled faintly of sulfur. The horses grew skittish, rolling their eyes. Steam curled from vents in the earth, rising like ghosts. LaRoque stepped back. By all the saints! Sawyer stared, mouth open. The rocks are hot. Elias knelt, brushing aside snow to reveal black basalt warm enough to melt frost at once. In shallow pits nearby, water bubbled despite the freezing air. The old man didn't lie, Elias murmured. Burning stones. Runs in the Snow did not kneel. He stood rigid, jaw tight. This place is wrong. The Shoshone rarely entered such lands. The stories said these vents were where the earth breathed, where spirits wandered in steam. But the map matched the basin perfectly. 3 ridges forming a crescent, a hill shaped like a broken tooth, and just beyond it, a narrow cleft, nearly invisible under snow. Elias felt his pulse quicken. There! They approached the cleft cautiously, sliding sideways along a wind-polished slope. The entrance was small, a split in stone that led into shadow. Snow had drifted deep around the opening, but beneath it, Elias uncovered something impossible. A wooden post, charred, weather-worn, and carved into it a simple Spanish cross. LaRoque's breath caught. Sawyer crossed himself without thinking. Runs in the Snow whispered something in Shoshone that no one asked him to translate. Elias brushed the frost from the carving, his gloved fingers tracing grooves cut more than half a century before. The dying wanderer had not been delirious. The map had not been a myth. The Spanish had come here once, far deeper into the high country than any historian claimed. Elias stepped back and stared into the narrow canyon ahead, silent, black, waiting. Tomorrow, he said. We go in at first light. The mountains did not answer. But the earth beneath them exhaled a slow, hot breath of steam as though something inside had been waiting. Dawn came slow and gray over the burning stone basin, the steam from the earth rising in pale coils that drifted like spirits through the cold. The narrow cleft ahead of the men looked no less forbidding in daylight. If anything, the new sun only sharpened its edges, casting long, jagged shadows across the entrance. Elias Boone Hardesty stood at the mouth of the canyon, one hand resting on the rawhide map in his possibles bag, the other gripping his long rifle. Behind him, the others prepared with nervous efficiency. LaRoque cinched his belt so tight he winced. Sawyer rubbed warmth into his fingers. Runs in the Snow studied the canyon walls with the posture of a man listening for voices the rest could not hear. The old man said the mines were hidden beyond a place like this, Elias murmured, more to himself than the others. A canyon where the stones burned underfoot. LaRoque spat to the side. Stones are burnin' sure enough. Question is, why'd the Spaniards come here? Ain't no silver worth a journey like this. Sawyer's voice wavered with hope. Maybe there was gold. Runs in the Snow shook his head sharply. Gold does not belong to these mountains. Only death waits in places like this. But men rarely listen to warnings carved from older wisdom. Curiosity, hunger, and the ache for something beyond beaver pelts pushed them forward. The first stretch of canyon narrowed so tight that the horses had to be left behind. Steam hissed from vents along the ground. and the walls, dark with basalt and streaked with mineral stains, rose 20 feet on either side. Snow clung to the stone in thin patches, melting near the warm fissures. LaRocque ran a hand along the canyon wall. "Feels? Worked. Like someone chipped at it." "Flooding does that," Sawyer countered. Then he frowned. "Or men do." The path widened suddenly into a chamber-like hollow where the walls bowed outward. Elias crouched near a scatter of stones. They were arranged in a rough circle, not naturally. Edges darkened, as if charred long ago. "Campfire," LaRocque whispered. Elias picked up one of the stones. "No, smelting stones. Assay testing." The men exchanged stunned looks. Spanish miners had been here, not passing through, not lost, but working. At the far end of the hollow, runs in the snow stopped dead. He raised a hand, signaling silence. Elias moved beside him. There, carved into the wall, was a symbol half covered by centuries of mineral runoff, a cross. Flanked by 2 parallel lines, the Spanish mark for survey boundary. Sawyer let out a soft, involuntary gasp. They were marking claims. "Jesuits or soldiers," Elias said quietly. "Hard to say which. Could have been an entrada. Or a rogue party. Some of them broke from official routes, chasing dreams." LaRocque crossed himself reflexively. "Ghost marks. 50 years old, maybe more." But Elias knew better. The carving had weathered edges deeper than a mere 50 years would allow. This mark could easily date back to the late 1700s, the era when Spanish expeditions pressed into the unknown for precious metals long rumored but seldom found. They continued deeper, the rawhide map matching the canyon's bend with uncanny precision. Near the third turn, Sawyer tripped over something and fell forward with a startled grunt. When he stood, he lifted what he thought was a stone. It wasn't a stone, it was metal, a rusted iron wedge, the kind used in old-world mining to split rock. The surface was pitted, but a faint engraving remained. F.R.C. LaRocque's voice dropped to a whisper. Initials of a Spanish hand. Elias brushed snow from the wedge. Or a whole party of them. Runs in the snow stepped back, uneasy. The mountains took them. See the cracks? The stone melts and shifts here. If they dug, the earth closed. His words proved prophetic. They found it just past a bend where steam poured from the ground in slow, ghostly curls. At first it looked like a wall of rubble, black stone, broken timbers, frost-crusted soil. But the angles told the truth. Elias crouched, sweeping away snow with slow, deliberate strokes until the shape revealed itself. An entrance, or rather, what had once been an entrance. A mine shaft, long collapsed. The timbers were charred on one side, burned from within. Sawyer swallowed hard. Did they try to blast something? Or seal something? LaRocque muttered. Maybe they found gold. Maybe someone wanted it buried. Elias leaned close, tracing a charred timber with gloved fingers. Spanish adit structure. Look here, hand-sawn wedges, same style as New Spain frontier mines. They were real miners, not explorers. Inside the rubble, something glinted. Sawyer reached for it. "Let me—" "Careful," Elias warned sharply. "Ground's unstable." But the object was close enough to grab safely. Sawyer pulled it free. A mule shoe, crooked, handmade, colonial pattern. No one spoke for a long moment. The wind sighed through the canyon, carrying the faint smell of sulfur. Runs in the snow whispered, "They died here." No one argued. They continued past the collapsed shaft, the map indicating one final landmark, a narrow side canyon that ended in a small shelf of stone. The dying wanderer had spoken of it with his last breaths. On the ledge, the sign of the king. When they reached the ledge, Elias felt his chest tighten. There, carved into the stone face, half covered by mineral crust but unmistakable, was the crest of the Spanish crown, the sigil of King Charles, a symbol that had no business being this far north. Not in Shoshone country, not in the heart of the Wind River wilderness. Sawyer stared as though witnessing scripture. This proves the mines were real. LaRocque shook his head. Then where is the gold? Elias did not answer. He was staring at the stone, feeling the weight of history pressing through the cold. Whatever the Spaniards found here, it had not been enough to carry out, or something had stopped them from ever leaving. And he felt in that strange, hot wind rising from beneath the earth that the mountain itself remembered. The wind changed as the men stood on the ledge beneath the Spanish crest. It gusted upward from the canyon floor in a slow, rolling breath, warm, sulfur-tinged, and old in a way that made the skin prickle. Elias Boone Hardesty felt it against his face, and knew with a quiet certainty that the mountain was telling them something, not in words, in memory, in remnants, in the weight of earth that had swallowed men whole half a century before. "We go down," Elias said at last, pointing to the slope that curved beneath the ledge. "The map ends here, but the old." Miners spoke of something below a place where they worked the rock. Larocque groaned. Worked? With what? Their bare hands? Sawyer bristled. There must be something down there. A chamber or a tunnel. Runs in the Snow's expression darkened. And bones. Do not forget the bones. The slope beneath the ledge was treacherous. The snow was thin, the ground beneath a mix of loose basalt and warm, unstable clay softened by steam vents. Each step sent small stones skittering into the darkness below, rattling through an unseen place. 10 yards down, the slope curved inward to reveal a hollow, not a natural cave, but the collapsed interior of an old excavation. Part of the roof had fallen ages ago, leaving an overhang supported by half-burned timbers. Elias crouched beside one, running his finger along its split grain. Hand sawn, Spanish. "Same cut as the adit." Larocque peered into the darkness. "What were they diggin'? Gold? Silver?" Sawyer swallowed. "We'll know once we look." Elias lit a pitch-pine baton, its flame flickering against the stone. The fire cast long shadows across the chamber, revealing rough wall markings, charcoal smears, symbols, and what looked like tally strokes. The rediscovery of such a place should have brought awe. Instead, the air felt thick with warning. Runs in the snow stood at the entrance, refusing to step inside. This is a place where spirits argued with men. Elias moved deeper, sweeping the flame across the cavern floor. Then the light caught something white, long, curved, silent. Sawyer stumbled back. "Bones?" Elias knelt. "Aye." He brushed away dust and ash. 2 skeletons lay together near the back wall, the remains twisted as though the men had died struggling for breath. Their clothing had rotted away centuries earlier, but their belts still bore buckles of hammered brass. One buckle carried a faint engraving, a stylized crown. The crest of the Spanish Bourbons, a royal mining party. Possibly a small survey team brought to assay a rumored vein. Larocque crossed himself fiercely. "Saints preserve us! They never left." Elias examined the stone wall behind the remains. Charcoal markings circled a small spot of reddish rock streaked with metallic sheen. He chipped a sample with his Green River knife and held it to the light. Sawyer's eyes widened. "Gold?" "No." Elias shook his head. "Iron oxide. Maybe a hint of copper. Nothing rich." Sawyer's shoulders sagged. The disappointment on his face was a shadowed thing. "So it was all for nothing." Elias continued studying the rock. "Not for nothing. They found something, just not what they hoped." He tapped the wall. "This was a false lead. The deposit's too thin. The mountain tricked them." "Runs," in the Snow's voice echoed from the entrance. "The mountain always wins when men dig at its heart." Near the bodies lay a weathered leather satchel, preserved by dry, heat, and ash. Elias lifted it carefully, the strap disintegrating in his hands. Inside were 2 objects, a rusted copper crucifix, hand-hammered, and a folded scrap of vellum. Larocque leaned close. "What's that?" Elias held the vellum near the torch. The ink had faded, the script warped by heat, but a few lines remained legible. "Cañón de las Piedras Ardientes, no oro, no plata, peligro, tierra viva." Sawyer crouched. "What does it say?" Elias translated quietly. "Canyon of the burning stones. No gold, no silver, danger, living earth. The rest was burned away. Sawyer's face tightened with frustration. So all this time, all the stories, no treasure? Elias folded the vellum gently. History is treasure, Sawyer. Truth is worth carrying. But the young man was shaking his head. Truth won't buy land, won't build a cabin, won't feed a family. If the old man died trying to protect this place, for what? Rocks and bones? A low rumble trembled beneath their feet, faint but unmistakable. The earth shifted, loosening dust from the far wall. Runs in the snow shouted, "Out! Now!" Elias did not argue. The mountain's breath had changed. He grabbed Sawyer by the coat and forced him toward the exit as small stones began to patter from the ceiling. Larocque scrambled behind them, swearing in French. As they burst into the cold air outside, the chamber collapsed inward with a muffled roar. Steam burst from the ground in a hiss of fury. The slope trembled, settling like a great beast resuming sleep. They stood breathing hard, snow swirling around them. Sawyer stared at the fallen earth, pale and shaken. "We could have died in there." Elias nodded. "Just like they did." They climbed back to the ledge in silence. No one spoke for a long time. The Spanish crest carved into the stone seemed to watch them, the symbol of a dream that had turned to ash. Larocque was the first to speak. "So that's it? The great Spanish mine, a hole full of dead men and worthless rock?" Elias tightened the strap on his possibles bag. "The mine wasn't the story." "Then what was?" Sawyer demanded. Elias looked out across the burning stone basin, steam rising like ghosts between the ridges. "The story is that they came, they tried, they were swallowed, and the mountains kept their secret. That's worth more than gold." Sawyer said nothing, but his jaw clenched in quiet bitterness. Runs in the Snow looked at Elias with somber understanding. "Truth is heavier than ore, harder to carry." Elias nodded. He knew what the next chapter of this journey would bring. Men rarely sought truth. They sought meaning. They sought wealth. They sought something to fill the quiet in themselves. And a legend that ended with nothing was a dangerous thing. The return journey out of the burning stone country began in silence, not the comfortable, quiet Elias Boone Hardesty was known for, but the strained kind that sat heavy between men. The truth they had uncovered, the bones they had seen, and the collapse that nearly buried them had shaken each traveler in a different way. The mountain had not rewarded them with treasure. It had merely shown them a grave older than any mapmaker's ink. Larocque trudged ahead with his jaw set hard, muttering in French when he thought no one heard. Runs in the Snow moved lightly, as though his feet sought to disturb the ground as little as possible, the weight of what they had seen pressing on him like a spiritual burden. Sawyer walked last, shoulders stiff, eyes narrowed at the trail, the disappointment radiating from him like heat from a forge. Elias led them, quiet as always, but with a new heaviness in his stride. He felt responsible not for the mountain's truth, but for the hope he'd allowed them to chase. Men could endure hunger, storms, grizzlies, and war parties, but it was disappointment that truly hollowed a man out. They camped just beyond the volcanic basin, where the earth cooled and the snow lay thick again. A stand of stunted pines offered shelter from the wind. They built a fire, but the warmth did little to thaw the mood. Sawyer finally broke the silence. "We risked everything for nothing." Larocque looked up sharply. "Not nothing. We found truth." "I can't sell truth," Sawyer snapped. "Can't eat it. Can't build a life out of it." Runs in the Snow stirred the fire with a branch. "Many men die for lies. Few die for truth. You walk away with your life. That is enough." Sawyer turned toward Elias. "Is it? You knew, didn't you? You knew the map might lead to nothing but ghost stories." Elias met his eyes evenly. "I knew the map was real. The rest I could only follow." "But why follow it at all?" Sawyer demanded. "Why chase something the Spaniards themselves couldn't survive?" Elias looked into the fire. Sparks rose, drifting into the dark like souls leaving bodies. "Because truth matters," he said quietly. "And because some roads don't let a man turn back once he's seen their beginning." Sawyer looked away, but the anger did not leave him. It settled deeper. A seed. Later, as they slept, the wind shifted. Runs in the Snow woke first, eyes snapping open. He pressed his ear to the ground, listening. Hoofbeats. Distant, but approaching. He nudged Elias awake. Riders. Elias rose without a word. LaRoque followed, clutching his trade gun. Sawyer blinked groggily, then froze at the sight of Runs in the Snow's expression. Blackfeet? LaRoque whispered. The Shoshone nodded slowly. 4, maybe 5. They follow our trail. The riders emerged at dawn, silhouettes on a ridgeline above the camp, 5 horsemen moving with deliberate calm. For a tense moment, LaRoque reached for his rifle, but Runs in the Snow shook his head. Not Blackfeet, he said. Crow. Elias exhaled. The Crow were dangerous when crossed, but not as prone to immediate war as the Blackfeet. Still, tension prickled the air as the men approached, faces stern, painted in winter patterns, eyes unreadable. Their leader dismounted, stepping forward with a slight tilt of his head, a gesture of wary respect. I am 2 Eagles, he said in Crow. Runs in the Snow translated quietly. 2 Eagles' gaze swept over the 4 trappers. We saw smoke from the burning stone country. No man hunts there. Why were you in that place? Elias answered truthfully. Following a map. 2 Eagles studied him for a long moment, then surprised them by laughing softly. White men love maps, even when the land itself warns them away. The Crow riders carried no open hostility, only curiosity. When Elias showed them a portion of the rawhide map, 2 Eagles frowned. This marking, he said, pointing at the Spanish crest, my grandfather saw something like this when he was a boy. He said, men with metal clothes dug at the mountain until it swallowed them. Elias nodded. We found the place, and the ones who never left. 2 Eagles grew solemn. Then you have seen a story older than your nation. The tension eased. The Crows shared dried chokecherries and fire-twisted meat, and in return the trappers gifted trade knives and cloth. The exchange was peaceful, even respectful. But the message was clear. You should leave this place, 2 Eagles said. Some stories belong to the dead. When the trappers finally returned to the Green River wintering camp, their faces wind-burned and weary, the men gathered instantly to hear what they had found. The story came slowly, at first hesitation, disbelief, curiosity. But the wolf story had laid the foundation. The Spanish crest, the collapsed mine, the bones, the hot earth, the Crow riders. Each detail spread quickly, growing in the retelling. LaRoque told it with embellishment. Sawyer with bitterness, Runs in the Snow with quiet caution. But it was Elias's silence that gave the tale its power. A silent man who carried a map no one believed, a silent man who walked into a forbidden canyon, a silent man who returned from the night of 20 wolves. Silence invited imagination, and imagination made legends. Weeks later, around a roaring fire at a different camp along the Snake River, an old trapper told a greenhorn, "Did you hear 'bout Hardesty, the quiet feller? Faced 20 wolves alone. Walked into a Spanish ghost mine. Found the sigil of King Charles carved high in the Rockies." The greenhorn blinked wide-eyed. "Is any of it true?" The old trapper spat into the fire and leaned close. "Boy, truth in these mountains is like a wolf track in new snow. Clear for a moment, then gone by morning. But I'll tell you this, Elias Boone Hardesty walked those trails. And the mountains remember a man like that." The greenhorn stared into the flames as though seeing a pet legend form before his eyes. And somewhere, on a ridge north of the Green River, the wind carried a lone wolf's cry as if answering the story.